Hello, my name is Dan Gagnon, here with the Danvers Historical Society. I'm going to be talking with you today about witch hunt locations in Danvers that can be walked to and are open air and able to be visited even during these times. I had spoken here at the Historical Society last year in person about how some of the victims of the 1692 Salem Village witch hunt were memorialized. And I'm very happy to be invited back in a very different format as I talk online. It's very different not having a crowd of people here in the hall. But hopefully today's presentation here that has a couple maps, some many pictures of sites, will give some ideas of places that you can go visit here in Danvers. Spend an afternoon strolling around the historic district to see some of these nationally famous sites. So here we have a map of the area as it looked in 1692, the year of the witch hunt. And to kind of put it in perspective for us who are not familiar with what this area looked like in colonial times. So this is the town of Salem. This would be where the bridge between Salem and Beverly is. It's the North River. We go over on Route 114. And so this area outlined in black is what Salem Village was at that point in time. Salem Village is primarily what is today Danvers. It also includes a small little bit of Peabody, and it includes Middleton as well, way over there. The Beverly border actually has moved in a little bit as well, but primarily it's the town of Danvers. And in 1692, Salem was divided into these two sections, Salem Village and then Salem Town down here. Salem Town is where the courthouse was, and so it gets most of the notoriety for the witch trials. But really the events began out here in Salem Village. This is where most of the main players lived, and where many of the early happenings occurred. So this is the area we are focusing in. And I'm going to zoom in on this area here, which is the old part of town. So to put it in perspective again, this is Peabody down here today, and this is Sylvan Street. So you have Sylvan Street to Ash Street by the police station, Ash coming up to Elm. This would be Danvers Square. It's only a three-way intersection though, because High Street doesn't exist yet, but this would be Locust. So if you're coming up Sylvan, this would also be Pine Street. Coming up here to this is Tapley Park today, the intersection with Holton Street, coming out to Center Street, and Center Street going across the highway. This is Hobart Street. So this is the Rebecca Nurse Homestead. That's the First Church of Danvers, and this is the area that we're going to be spending our time in today. And here's our modern map of the same. You have Pine Street, the Rebecca Nurse Homestead, Holton to Center, Hobart this way, Center Street that way. And we're going to kind of just work our way down Center Street. We're going to start with the Salem Village training field, the Salem Village Parsonage site where the minister lived at the time of the witch hunt. Then we're going to get to Ingersoll's Tavern at the corner of Hobart and Center. Then across the street to the first church that was the Salem Village Church at that point in time. And then over here to the memorial of the victims of the witch hunt. So these are just 5 spots. There are many others as well. I would suggest to see others just to walk down this section of Center Street. There's plenty of 17th century homes and 18th century homes, some of which the 17th century ones were homes of those involved in the witch hunt. So our first stop being the training field way up there. We have one other map I actually wanted to show you before we got going. This map is actually less helpful as a map, but it's important because it's from 1911, and so it shows you that these sites have been visited as tourist attractions for quite a lot of time. My presentation is not the first in terms of listing out these sites to be visited. So at the village training field, our first stop. The training field appears just a park today, section of green grass surrounded by street on all 4 sides. So on the left, the road is Center Street. On the right, this is Ingersoll Street leading into Glen Magna and the Endicott Park area. So the village training field is really important as we talk about sites in Salem Village. It might not seem it just being an open field, But the training fields, it's training in the sense of militia training, militia drilling during the 1600s and 1700s. You can think of the Minutemen who fought during the American Revolution. This is where they would gather to train several times a year to drill. And it's important in terms of Salem Village because this is the first step that Salem Village took towards becoming eventually its own town, what's now Danvers. And this first step was, before this, the militia had to go to downtown Salem to drill and train because they were still part of Salem. People in Salem Village didn't really like this because they were sending all of their militia to downtown Salem while they were actually the ones in the frontier. And so Salem Village was actually far more likely to be attacked. So why would you have sentry duty downtown instead of having sentry duty on the frontier? So in the 1660s, they petitioned the Massachusetts legislature to get their own separate militia, and then they had their own separate training field soon after. So this is really the first step towards Danvers becoming its own town, which is why it's important in this sense. The land is donated, I'll zoom in on that giant rock. The monument, donated by Nathaniel Ingersoll, whose house is one of our other stops we'll get to in a moment. And he donated as a training place forever to Salem Village, and it's still owned by the town of Danvers today. To give you an idea of its original use, I have a couple photos from this past spring. The Danvers Alarm List Revolutionary War reenactors, along with the Historical Society and DCAT, put together a program for Patriots Day. Since this Patriots Day commemoration is done every year at the training field, but this year you couldn't really have crowds of people attend, it was recorded and broadcast. And so these are some photos from that. You can see the Revolutionary War reenactors, the alarm list out there, and then on the other side, firing a volley there. So I show these to show you kind of what its original purpose was. So once we start to have that movement from the training field towards becoming a separate community from the city of Salem, we're going to see that starts to be pushed in other ways. Right after that, Salem Village asked to become their own town, and the city of Salem told them no. Prior to that, several towns have been part of Salem. Wenham, Manchester, Beverly, Marblehead, and all of those had split away because it's a long walk from Wenham to downtown Salem back then before you had any bridges. And so it didn't make sense to have to go to town meeting in downtown Salem, to go to church in downtown Salem. Once all those communities broke away, Salem Village thought they were next. But the city of Salem did not want to be any smaller than it was. And they lost all this tax revenue, they lost all this land when those towns broke away. So they really kept hold on Salem Village. The next step, what Salem Village did prior to the witch hunt, is a petition to have its own church and its own minister. That got it most of the way towards being its own town, but not totally. So our next step is here, where the minister lived in Salem Village. The minister at the time of the witch hunt is Reverend Samuel Paris, sort of seen in many books about the witch hunt, particularly works of fiction, as sort of a negative character at that point in time, and certainly he does play into the witch hunt and support it when clearly innocent people were accused, such as Rebecca Nurse and others. He does testify against them. So what's left of the house where Reverend Paris lived is actually behind Center Street, which is why the circle is a little back. But right next to number 67 Center Street is a cart path. And with this one, I included several photos really so we can kind of orient ourselves as to where it is and how you can actually go to visit. Since it is town-owned land that's open to the public, it just might seem kind of tucked out of the way. So we have our Historic Commission sign here that really relates it clearly to the witch hunt itself. It talks about Samuel Paris ministered during the witch hunt. And at the bottom it talks about that being where those who later claimed to be, as they said, they were afflicted. They claimed that witchcraft was being done to them. They appeared unwell. They had what were called fits, almost like seizures, rolling around on the floor. That's where it first began, and that's why it's key. I would point out this sign really seems to place a fair amount of the blame on Tituba, Reverend Paris' Native American slave. That's sort of an outdated point of view, and it's not likely that she's the one who told them stories of witchcraft, as the sign says, but she is the first to be accused. So this is from Center Street. This is what it looks like as you're going by. So it is on the north side of Center Street next to 67. This is the sign from the street to let you know it's there. It is kind of small. And right here is a cart path that leads seemingly into the woods. So this is a picture of the path you would walk down. Again, it is a public path. And then when you get back there, there's a clearing. And in the clearing, we have the cellar holes of the Salem Village Parsonage. So the Salem Village Parsonage was there from the 1680s until the 1780s, roughly a century. Over that time, several ministers had lived there, prior to and of course after Reverend Paris. But 1784, the house was partly taken down, partly moved, so it really is just the foundation that remains. Within this home, we have foundations under 2 rooms. So it's actually a 3rd room that didn't have a foundation, so it's bigger than it looks from that. It was in this house that the witch hunt first begins. So Reverend Paris lived there with his wife Elizabeth, and they had several children with them as well. 2 that become really important during the witch hunt is his young daughter, also named Elizabeth, usually just Betty Paris, and his niece Abigail Williams. Niece doesn't exactly mean what it does today, but it meant that she was some sort of female relative, and they had apparently adopted her, so she lived with them as part of the family. And so Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, one day in late January 1692, begin being unwell. As I actually started to mention, it seemed like they had seizures. They rolled around on the floor. They crawled under tables. They crawled under chairs. They claimed that they could see images of spirits, of specters, that they called them. And they claimed that these specters, these images, were the ones that were harming them. And that the specters were torturing, were pricking them with pins, tortures such as that. And it was quite frightening to the Paris family. Not quite clear what was going on. You can only imagine the worry of the parents seeing these young children acting in such a way that they couldn't quite explain. Soon there were a few other young women in Salem Village that began to act similarly. Those who did not live near the parsonage, quite far across the village. So somehow that spread. Their parents all knew each other, so perhaps they had interacted and had seen what was going on. It's most likely. But once it begins to spread, Reverend Paris and the other parents of those who were unwell, they call a whole series of doctors to try to figure out what is going on, because it was not something they could really wrap their minds around. The doctors they called couldn't find a medical reason at that point for this. They went through all of their medical books, and there didn't really seem to be anything that fit. They ruled out several things right away. It wasn't seizures caused by epilepsy was one thing that they ruled out that seemed sometimes similar to what was going on. And eventually there was one doctor, usually thought to be the Salem Village doctor, Dr. Griggs, who said that they were under, quote, an evil hand, meaning he thought it was something not medical, an evil hand meaning witchcraft. And once he says that, that is from that point on really kind of assumed to be the reason. So it's that turning point, and all of that does begin here in the parsonage, making it a key historic site. Reverend Paris, during the witch hunt, he will preach sermons, clearly that he believed his little community was under attack by the devil, by the legions of Satan. He will testify against several of those who were accused. Now, his testimony isn't really adding accusations against the almost 200 people that end up being accused of witchcraft. What he does is he testifies saying, I saw these people having their fits and claiming that they're being attacked by specters. But the way that he testifies, he totally believes is true. He swears under oath, not that he saw Ann Putnam being attacked, seeming like she was being attacked by a specter. He says, with different examples, I saw them attacked, So he believes it's real. He is not hedging. He's not playing it safe in court. He's kind of all in that it is real. And you can really see that from his testimony. Prior to the witch hunt, the parsonage and Reverend Paris had been really controversial. Some in the village wanted to hire him as minister, some didn't. While he had been there, some people who didn't want him in the first place weren't paying their taxes to support him. And there's an issue where Reverend Paris claimed he owned the parsonage, whereas Salem Village claimed that the community owned it as like public land, and there was a dispute. So his time in the village prior to 1692 was anything but calm, and the previous ministers had had many other disputes as well. So really the ministry in Salem Village was a lightning rod for years over controversies. And it continued to be after the witch hunt. After the witch hunt, Reverend Paris continues as minister, seemingly with the idea that everything's going to go back to normal and he's going to continue to be the minister of Salem Village. But after that year where 19 are hanged, one's pressed to death, 5 die in jail, almost 200 people are accused of witchcraft, it really tears apart all of northeastern Massachusetts, not just Salem Village. People were accused as far north as Salisbury, as far south as Charlestown. It's really the whole North Shore. He can't just go back to normal after that, despite trying. And so he's eventually forced out from Salem Village. It's really the families of those who were executed, in part based on his testimony, that they will not step foot in Reverend Paris's church as long as Reverend Paris is the minister. And it's quite clear why they would feel such a way. They blamed him as being responsible, at least partly, for the deaths of their family members and their loved ones. Reverend Paris, years later, through the mid-1690s, still refuses to admit he did anything wrong, which also gets in the way of reconciliation in Salem Village, as you can imagine. With the parsonage, it was then later used by ministers until 1784. At that point, the building, as I mentioned, partly taken down, partly moved. The part that was moved also doesn't exist today. That's gone. It was just filled in, used as a field for many years, centuries. And then it wasn't until the 1970s that it's unearthed in an archaeological dig. The dig was led by Richard Trask of Danvers and Roland Robbins, an archaeologist, who had worked on other projects such as the birthplace of Thomas Jefferson. He had excavated the Saugus Iron Works, which is now a part of the National Park. And so this was another project. And the number of items that were found during this dig, well, first of all, they found the foundation. But the items found, it's about 30,000 items that were dug up, little bits of pottery to little pieces of, or large pieces of silverware. They found things with Reverend Paris's initials on them. And so it was truly a huge find, and it's a find related to the witch hunt, also a find related to its excavating a 17th century household. So what did the people eat? What did they own? So it really gives you a view into daily life here in Salem Village as well. And next to the parsonage, here's Reverend Paris. We only have one known image of him. It's actually in the Massachusetts Historical Society. And his sermons have been published for the years around the witch hunt. So that's a good source. Here's another view of the foundation as you were to walk in. So that entrance would have been outside the house. The wall of the house would have been there, kind of like a bulkhead. And the field next to the parsonage, that actually is just the backyard of the house next door, plays into the witch hunt as well. Early in the witch hunt, Reverend Paris had left the village for a day. There was a minister giving a sermon on a Thursday in a neighboring town. He went to go see that sermon, and he left his family at home. Those who claimed to be afflicted of witchcraft really sort of upped their accusations on this particular day when he was out of town. So this field, the pasture next to the parsonage, they claimed on that late winter day that an entire army of Satan's soldiers had appeared to them. Satan's swordsman was the phrase. And they claimed that witches flew in on, not brooms, that's a modern idea, but they flew in on like poles from all over, and that they had a black mass, essentially, in Reverend Paris's yard. This plays into many themes of the witch hunt. that did make it seem as though their accusations are related to an attack on the Salem Village Church. You can tell going to the Christian minister's backyard and having a black mass, it's kind of as pointed as that could be. And this will happen several times that they claim there's a gathering in the parsonage. And basically each time the story is recounted, they recount a couple more people who attended from Salem Village who are then formally accused of witchcraft later on. At one of them they'll say that Rebecca Nurse is there drinking blood. At another one they say her sister Sarah Cloyce is there. They'll later say that the Reverend George Burroughs, a minister in Salem Village before Reverend Paris, that he showed up from Maine to attend this evil mass at the village parsonage. So although it is today just a field, it plays into a lot of the accusations against those in 1692. And so this is looking back out to Center Street as one were to leave the parsonage site. And so as we go out, we're going to be going left down Center Street. Right next to the opening to the parsonage site, just worth noting as we move on, is actually the next parsonage from 1784. So this was the First Church of Danvers Parsonage. It was the Church of Salem Village, then the First Church of Danvers, the same congregation, the same institution. So this does still stand. I have a nice 1890s photo of it, but it's there today. It has a fence in front now. And this is noteworthy because we don't have a lot of homes like this in Danvers, really fancy houses from the time of the Revolution. Most of ours are from colonial times in that neighborhood in terms of the pre-United States homes. So this is really nice. It's a beautiful Georgian house. So that was the second parsonage. So we started the training field. We were at the parsonage, so we're going to head back down Center Street to Ingersoll's Tavern, which is at the corner of Hobart and Center. It's one of those homes, one of those historic sites that is probably driven by many people in Danvers without quite realizing the significance behind it. Definitely driven by often since it's on a prominent corner. And with its prominent corner, it was the prominent corner then. As with the early map I showed, Center Street being one of the original roads going into Holton Street, and also Hobart Street. So this was the crossroads, the downtown basically of Salem Village. It wasn't really much of a downtown since it was a farming community. There wasn't shops or anything like that. It's the center simply because that's where the minister lived, that's where the church was, and that's where the village tavern was, which of course was a popular spot. So it's owned by Nathaniel Ingersoll during the time of the witch hunt. He establishes the tavern in 1677, and he's the one who owned the training fields, which was our first stop on our little walking tour here. So he's the one that donated that field to be used by the militia. He donates it to Salem Village, and then it becomes town Danvers property. So this home is interesting. It is a privately owned house today. So in terms of visiting, it's one that one could walk by and take a picture of, but you can't visit inside. And it really is one of the most important historical structures that is standing in Danvers, and definitely the most important historical structure that's not owned by a historic preservation group or owned by a museum, just solely a private building. With this, it's key to Salem Village in that it's the tavern, and we might have views of Puritans as, well, probably our stereotype does not have them hanging out in bars a lot. Contrary to that, they hung out at the tavern a lot. And they served beer, ale, sometimes wine, rum, hard cider. Hard cider was really popular in New England. They just called it cider because why would you make apple cider without that? So that was the standard drink at that point in time. If one looks at the court records for 1600s Essex County, if you look at the Salem court records, there's a lot of instances of drunkenness and people getting in trouble for that. Taverns were really regulated. You could only stay so late, about sunset or 9 p.m., kind of depending on the time of year. And if one was caught too many times drinking too much in the tavern, you'd have to wear a scarlet letter. Not like Nathaniel Hawthorne's scarlet letter, an A for adultery. You'd have to wear a giant red D denoting that you were a drunk. But not just a social gathering spot, the tavern is where village government committees met, and it's where many of those who were arrested for witchcraft were first taken, which is how it's key to our walkable witch trial sites here. So when one was accused, we can use Rebecca Nurse as an example. She had been accused by some members of the Putnam family and others who lived way out by, towards the Middleton line today, kind of the cornfields near where the state hospital was, is where they had lived. And once Rebecca Nurse was accused, 2 people wrote into Salem town to the judges. They wrote out a official complaint and accusation, and the next morning she was arrested at her house on what's now Pine Street. As soon as she was arrested, she was taken right to the tavern, and it's believed, not entirely clear, that those who were taken there were kept, not exactly handcuffed, but chained in one of the upstairs rooms. So the downstairs rooms would have been the bar rooms. The upstairs rooms, one would have been the private room of the Ingersoll family. They ran the tavern, but it was also their house. And other rooms upstairs were rented out. A tavern was also a hotel at that point, pretty much. It didn't have hotels like we think of it. So they were kept somewhere up here, and oftentimes the court would meet, for previous instances, in the bar room, because it was sort of the only public gathering spot in the village. Everything else was somebody's house. And then there was the meeting house where the church was. What they ended up doing during the witch hunt is a few people are first questioned by the judges here. Many others, particularly as it gets going, will be questioned in the meeting house where the church met, simply because once people in Salem Village heard about these witchcraft accusations, so many people showed up to witness the happenings that they couldn't fit in the bar room. So that's when they moved to the meeting house. But those who were arrested are kept here. Several of them are examined here by the judges. Kind of the first step after your arrest was you were just questioned by the judges. It's not quite an arraignment, but you would be questioned and then they decide, are you held in jail for a full trial or not? That's sort of the process that happens here. With that, because it's the village gathering spot, there are many instances of accusations that are lodged from this building and right in front of this building. One key instance is Reverend Paris. His Native American slave Tituba was the first accused, as she lived in that household where the fits of the afflicted first began. And she had a husband, John Indian. And John Indian actually was hired out by Reverend Paris. Although he was a slave, he was kind of rented, I guess it's an uncomfortable word to use, to Nathaniel Ingersoll to work as his bartender sometimes. And John Indian was known for putting on a show for those who visited. He would show them scars on his arm and say that they had been done to him by witchcraft the previous week, really talking it up, kind of seeming as if he's, getting these visitors' attention. Some visitors later wrote that it was quite clear that those scars were, years old and had nothing to do with witchcraft. But it makes an impression on anybody who visited Salem Village that year. Also, we have, sitting in the bar room, there's an instance where there's 2 gentlemen from Beverly who had come to the village tavern for whatever reason. And they hear some of those who had lodged accusations of witchcraft against others in Salem Village basically admitting that it was a joke. They say that it was just a jest. And then another one says they did it for sport. So that's an important turning point. And definitely an important document that we have that's written down. And it's written down because they then went to the court and testified that they had heard the accusers say this to discredit them. That happens here. Also, there are instances where, when it's really crowded with people in Salem Village, the accusers would, it seems like, put on a show. They would claim in the middle of the very crowded room that they saw the specter of somebody over there and over there. And at one point in time, they get two young men from Salem Village to draw their swords, and they have in the bar room of the tavern what they claim is a sword fight against these spirits and these specters. Of course, they would have been, standing on stools, standing on tables, swinging in the air, and nobody else saw these spirits, but just took the word of the accusers that they were there. And then as that continued in quite a scene, they later claimed that these Salem Village guys with their swords had won the fight. Again, how could you tell? They're just swinging at the air. But they claimed that they won, and they claimed that the entire floor of the tavern was covered in like ghostly, spectral blood. That again, nobody else could see, but that's what they said. There's also a scene out front where one of the accusers convinces a local farmer that a witch has appeared. Reverend George Burroughs, actually the previous minister, he just appears on the street and is somehow cursing her. And so he goes around and he throws his pitchfork, and then she says, "Oh no, you missed him, he's over there." And he throws his pitchfork over there. "Oh, you hit his coat, but you didn't hit him, throw it over there." And so he throws his pitchfork there, which also must have been quite a scene, standing in front of the crowded village tavern. So really an important site, but one that's kind of tucked away. So we're going to be moving, our next two are very related. We're going to talk about the church, the Salem Village Church, the first church, and then the memorial. As we talk about this, the church today is actually its second location. Its first location was right across from the memorial, and that's where they put the memorial to those who died in 1692 there. So our last two spots are definitely connected here. So today known as the First Church of Danvers, it was the Church of Christ in Salem Village. Every Puritan church, with the Puritan church later becoming the Congregational Church, every one of them was titled the Church of Christ in whatever town you were in. There was only one church in each town, so you were the church in town. The Puritans had come over from England. They were a Protestant group, really radical Protestant group. They thought the Reformation hadn't gone far enough in terms of the Church of England. But as part of the Reformation in England, going back to Henry VIII, the king had put himself not just in charge of the country, but in charge of the church. So your religious opinions were also political opinions, and the king didn't really like that. So they were persecuted, and that's why they had all come over to New England in the first place. With each town having its own church, it was supported by the town. Salem Village, one of the main roles of the Salem Village government was to collect taxes to pay the minister and for the church building. In Danvers, the first church of Danvers was supported by the taxpayers until 1828, way after the Constitution. It was thought the whole separation of church and state only applied to the federal government, and so the states could do whatever they wanted. In this case, Massachusetts let each town pick whatever church they wanted to support. So it's a long-standing Danvers institution. Well over 3 centuries it's been here. This is a much more modern building, built in the late 20th century. It's burned down a few times, and it's been moved. So the first meeting house during the witch hunt looked just like this. This is a copy of the Rebecca Nurse homestead, but it would have been on Hobart Street, right at the end of Forest Street, right across from the memorial today. For the second one, we don't have a reproduction building, so a pen and ink image is the best that we can get for that. The second meeting house is important in that after the witch hunt, this is where the minister after Reverend Paris preached. It's built around 1700, so only a couple of years after Reverend Paris leaves. And it's really like the fresh start, basically. It's a new minister. Those who had been refusing to attend church, as long as Reverend Paris was the minister, they finally come back. It is kind of a sign of reconciliation. And so this was located where the first church is today. With it as a sign of reconciliation, it's where Little Ann Putnam, one of the prime accusers in 1692, later apologizes for her role in the witch hunt. It's important in that sense. And moving way more ahead, this is important during the Revolution. This is where the Danvers town meeting met when they effectively declared that they would no longer listen to the King of England. They voted that they were no longer bound by the laws of England and only bound by the laws of Massachusetts, which is effectively declaring independence in that sense. So it's important there as well. With the building today, as we had our first picture, there is a nice sign. The 300th anniversary of Massachusetts in 1930, the state had gone around and put these signs in many truly significant historic places all across Massachusetts. And in Danvers, there were only 3. There was one where George Jacobs' house was, one of those accused of witchcraft in 1692. There was one for the Endicott pear tree behind the old Sylvania building, behind the Mass General building on Endicott Street. And this is the third, and this is the only one that's left in place. So clearly, in 1930, this was seen as one of the most important historic sites in the state. And really the sign, if I go back to the text, it really focuses on the reconciliation after the witch hunt, and is definitely a more positive spin on it. So in 1697, after Paris, Reverend Paris leaves, Joseph Green is the next minister. He's 22, he's young. That really adds to this being a fresh start with the Salem Village Church, and that he's a very new generation, just graduated college kind of minister. And so the marker does mention really the reconciliation. It also mentions that Reverend Green was really good at hunting. Not sure that would have been one of the first things I'd put on the historic marker, but it's there. It really doesn't mention much about the witch hunt itself, though. As part of their remembering in 1930, they tried to focus on some of the more positive aspects of Massachusetts history. It would be interesting to see in 10 years if they do 400th anniversary signs. I'm sure that pretty much all of them would be phrased differently and have different, maybe a little more realistic words there. With the church, so again, its original location was here across from the memorial. So the memorial will be our last stop of our tour in pictures here. So the Salem Village Witch Hunt Memorial was put up in 1992 by people of Danvers. It's very significant for a few reasons. Really, in Salem Village for the years after the witch hunt, you had people living side by side, some whose ancestors had been accusers, some who had been accused of witchcraft, and there's a true uneasiness. The uneasiness started to go away in the 1880s when in Danvers they put up the memorial to Rebecca Nurse, who had been executed for witchcraft. In Peabody, right after 1900, they put up it's a small memorial. It was a boulder and had a little plaque to John Proctor, who was executed for witchcraft. So there's a little bit of movement there, but it's not really until 1992 that the community really comes to terms with its really awful heritage from the 17th century. So this memorial, it's on town-owned land. This is the Gates soccer field back there. But it was not financed by the town. It was financed entirely by donations. Now, the town donated the land, of course, which is an important contribution, but not financially. This was the product of a fundraising campaign. There were walkathons through the historic district, starting at the Nurse House that drew hundreds of people. Local civic organizations, community groups donated money. And in that sense, it really is like a genuine community project that there was large involvement, which does, at the end result, make it more significant and representative of the community. In terms of Salem Village, now Danvers, first the town of Salem, which is the city of Salem, this memorial is also different. It's the only memorial to everybody we know that died in 1692. You have the 19 hanged, the one pressed to death, and you also have the 5 who died in jail. Salem has a memorial near the Charter Street Cemetery. You may have seen it. It's like small granite benches, and each bench has a name of one of the 19 who were executed. That memorial was sort of done in a very different way. It was an international design contest. It was financed by the city, and it was much less of a community project. It also leaves out the names of the at least 5 we know who died in jail during the witch hunt, so it's not even a memorial to everyone, really. Whereas this one is. So what we have, kind of our setup here, it's meant to be stood in front, and I will in a moment zoom in kind of on that part so you can see what it looks like when you stand there. We have in memory of those innocents who died during the Salem Village witchcraft hysteria of 1692. We have what's supposed to be like a Bible box you put on your podium, and what is a book on top of it, as a 17th century Puritan church would have. It's not necessarily, or it's only partly, a religious motif though, and that's really key to how this works. What we have as we zoom in is the Book of Life, is what's written on here, and we have some Puritan symbols. At the time, kind of some daisy wheels that they would carve into wood. The Book of Life has 2 meanings. The first meaning is, it is a biblical reference. in the book of Revelation is mentioned that, at the final judgment, there'll be a literal book with the names of those who are to be saved written in the book of life. It ties to the witch hunt because that is brought up in some of the accusations. There's one example where Mrs. Ann Putnam, in the presence of a minister and several others, claims to see Rebecca Nurse's specter, and she yells at Rebecca Nurse's specter, "Your name will be blotted out of the book of life forever," because she claimed she was a witch, in which case he would not be saved. So that's that. But it's also meant as sort of a historical image. It's meant to be history. The books, the history books have finally redeemed, in a different sense, those who were accused of witchcraft. So it's great how it plays two roles here. And so does that image there. I hope it shows up for the camera. It's an image of somebody wearing a 17th century suit, holding a book. That could be viewed as a minister or it could be viewed as a judge. It's meant intentionally, not clear. Though in terms of the witch hunt, certainly it is the role of the judge that was deciding life and death and the veracity of the accusations. And here on the wall behind this wall, we have a quote by all those who were executed for witchcraft. Rebecca Nurse says that she is innocent and God will clear her innocency. We have many other powerful quotes as well. There's George Jacobs, whose home was off of Water Street. He says, "Well, burn me or hang me, I will stand in the truth of Christ." So we have these really punchy and powerful statements of these people claiming that they were innocent once they were questioned by the judges. And that's really an important addition compared to, I would say, the small memorial in Salem. And you can kind of see it through their own words. So as a memorial of a historical event, there's a few better things than using someone's own words. And lastly, with this box, and you can see the judge, the words, the idea is if you stand right here, zooming in again, it's supposed to have you kind of think about what you would have done at that point in time as you're standing in front of a judge and you see the powerful words expressing their innocence of those who were accused. It's meant to kind of ask you the question, would you have been, brave enough to claim to be innocent, or would you have been, kind of cowed into falsely confessing, as some did during the witch hunt there. So it's important that it kind of leaves that question for the visitor. And so that's our last stop on our walk through the old part of town here. So we start at the training fields, down to the Parsonage behind 67 Center, to the Ingersoll house at the corner of Center and Hobart, the First Church, and the memorial there. And as I mentioned, there are plenty of others within walking distance you can go by. Just this stretch, you walk by many 17th century homes. There's the Judge Samuel Holton house there. The house was also there during the witch hunt. His ancestor Sarah Holton accused Rebecca Nurse, among others. There's Rebecca Nurse homestead. So it is definitely a neighborhood worth a walk. But those are the key highlights in terms of the witch hunt. There are several others with the Revolutionary War, but we'll leave that for another time. So thank you for joining us in a very different way for an online presentation today. Thank you to the Historical Society for inviting me to talk to you about some of these walkable witch hunt locations.